So welcome everybody to this session on inequality and fairness, which is organized by the Center for Economic Behavior and Inequality, CEBI, at the University of Copenhagen. The session has two presentations by two fantastic researchers, Stefanie Stantcheva from Harvard and Ernst Fehr from Zürich. They will present new research that combines experimental and survey data with administrative data to provide new answers to big questions like what is the role of preferences for inequality, how do people perceive inequality, and how do preferences and perceptions of people affect their views on redistributive policy. Each presenter will have only 20 minutes, which leaves 5 minutes for questions, and they will be allowed to talk for 20 minutes without interruption. If you have any questions, then you can raise your hands in the Q&A function and I can give you the word, or you can write questions in the chat that I will then read up. And I think we should just get going. So I will give the word to Stefanie Stantcheva. Stephanie, thank you so much for coming here today.
Thank you very much. I wish we were in Copenhagen. Thank you all for making it at this time. I wanted to talk about a project that is actually joined with Klaus and also with Christopher Hvitberg, and try to relate it during the talk, but also during the Q&A, to how one can more generally leverage the combination between administrative data and survey data to answer really interesting questions. So in this project, the questions that we are trying to address are these very long-standing topics in social sciences more generally on how social status, your perceived social position relates to the unfairness or fairness that you perceive. And then very precisely to political economy and public economics, where relative income or income positions seem important for fairness considerations and the design of policy, but with less empirical evidence, today to really show this and elicit this rigorously. So what we're trying to ask more precisely here is, how well do people even know their own social position and those of others? And we're interested in several reference groups. You may be able to rank yourself among different people, in the country as a whole, in your cohort, among those with the same education, etc. We then want to know how important social positions are for people's views of fairness or unfairness of inequality. And then we would like to compare how do people view unfairness within different groups? Are there specific types of fairnesses that are more fair than others? And are they more or less informed about these types of fairness, these types of inequalities? So this is where the methodology really comes in and is incredibly valuable. What we're going to be able to do here is to link subjective and objective data for a large sample in Denmark. The subjective part is survey data and an information experiment that's designed by us, where we can talk to people about their income. We can ask them about their social position, in particular, their percentile position within your cohort, and then within different reference groups like education groups, sector groups, gender, your municipality, etc., including also very small groups like your immediate neighbors, co-workers in your firm. And then we have objective data, which is the admin data, the records that have detailed info from the tax returns, not just today, but going back in time, that can let us see where you actually rank today relative to all those people. And what has happened to you in the past, how have you switched position, what shocks have happened to you, for instance, unemployment, disability, etc. So a very rich combination of subjective survey data and objective data on histories of income and all your reference groups. And so what we did is to distribute the survey to around 50,000 people who are born in those particular cohorts from 1969 to 73. So people who are very much in the midst of their working years, definitely done with education, but still far from retirement. And we distributed this through the digital post, that is this official mailbox with which people get communications on tax issues and other admin related things that people do actually tend to check and take seriously. And because it's sent through this, and in cooperation with Statistics Denmark, we can link the survey responses to the registered data And the link is, it's not a fuzzy link, it's a very precise link based on your identifier. The survey itself starts with asking you about your background, like your gender, your municipality, education, etc. This we actually know from the registered data, but the goal is to see whether we have the same, info as people perceive themselves. And so that's as a check here. We ask about income in a detailed way in chunks. And then we can compare this to the tax return income. Then we ask people about their perceptions about income positions and distribution. And for this, we actually start with a nice explainer video that tells people, here's what percentiles mean with the help of a ladder that I'll show you in a second. The median is the middle here, it's P50. The top 5%, the richest people, we call that the P95. So we explain very precisely with the ladder what this means, because we're going to use this recurringly to ask people about their positions. After that comes an information treatment where we actually tell people their true position in all these reference groups. And then we have 3 major outcomes, among others, that we ask about, which is, how do people perceive inequality in each of these groups, how fair it is? What do they think about the role of effort versus luck? And then also, what are their political views and who they plan to vote for? So let me go into just very quickly some key results that we find. And the first thing is that people are actually quite accurate when you ask them about the median income of their cohort or the median income of various groups, like people with the same education or people in the same sector, etc. There is, however, a little bit of a pattern, which is that if you are yourself richer, you think others are also richer. And if you are poor, you think others are also poor. So the higher you are, the more you think everybody else is, earns more too. So everybody thinks that others are closer to themselves than they truly are. So that's true if you look at the median income that people perceive, and that's true if you look at the P95 that people perceive. Now, what's really interesting is to see where people actually rank themselves in their own cohort. And so this is the result here. So on the horizontal axis here, it's the true position of the person in their cohort. So look at the left panel here. You can see, for instance, someone at the 20th percentile, someone at the 40th percentile. And then the vertical axis shows you the average perception by bin of position of those respondents. You can look either at the average perception by bin or the median. It's relatively similar. You can see this inverted S pattern whereby respondents that are ranked lower overestimate their position, while those that are ranked higher underestimate their position. And so this pattern will be recurrent if we look at all the reference groups. But to some extent, what we noticed is that this may be a bit mechanical, because if you're at the bottom, you can't really underestimate your position. And if you're at the top, you can only weakly underestimate it. And this is because perceived positions are not uniformly distributed, unlike actual positions. And so there's a way to roughly correct for this, which is what's shown on the right. So what we do here is to re-rank respondents by their perceived position. So creating a uniformly distributed bins of the perceived distribution, and then plot these against actual position. So here what we're asking is really, is a respondent who's ranked at X in the perceived position distribution also ranked at X in the actual distribution? And as you see, the answer is almost yes. So now the misperceptions are much reduced. If you want, the mechanical misperceptions are much reduced, but nevertheless, the pattern remains that people at the bottom tend to overestimate their position and people at the top tend to underestimate it. As I told you, this is true for all the reference groups. So if I show you the same graph here, based on position within each reference group against, the perceived, against the actual position, and we do this for cohort, for gender, within your municipality, within your education group, within your sector, you can see these same patterns appear. And here's also something else to notice, which is that there's 2 groups that stand out, which is sector and education. People are generally quite accurate, about positions and medians and top incomes in most reference groups, but they're much less accurate for sector and education groups. And in particular, there's 2 types of errors they're making. One is that in the high-paying sectors, which good news for many people here are groups like master and PhD, or finance and insurance for work. Those are actually groups where people are highly paid, and respondents tend to really underestimate how much the high paid people are making. And as a result of this, as you see on this graph, these are also the groups where people really tend to overestimate their position. You see that someone who's, for instance, at the 20th percentile truly in their sector actually thinks they're more at the 42nd, 3rd percentile. So these two groups are groups where people underestimate inequality and hence overestimate their position. So we also enlisted views on small reference groups, and I want to show those because they may be very relevant for people, very close to people, and they're typically incredibly difficult to get at with survey data. So for small reference groups, we adapt the questions, and for instance, for coworkers, which is shown as an example on this slide, we will first ask people, how many coworkers do you have? And then interactively adapt the question on the next slide to say, you said you have 50 coworkers. From 1 out of 50, where would you rank yourself? So it's a very precise way of asking. And because of that, we can actually see very much the positions that people think they are in these smaller groups. And so what we can see here, if you look at these smaller groups, is something that's very similar to the large groups results. If you want to think of the coworkers as sort of the small group equivalent to the sector, and then neighbors as the small group equivalent to the municipality. So you see again that people are actually really inaccurate for their coworkers, and with the same pattern as for the sector, people really overestimate where they rank among their coworkers. People are much more accurate in predicting their position among their neighbors, as they were also more accurate in predicting their position in their municipality. And if you look at the far right panel, you can see that people are even more accurate to predict their position among their former schoolmates that they went to school with when they were 15 than they are at predicting their position among coworkers today. The second part of the paper turns to what actually is the relation between these perceptions of social position and views on inequality. And verbally, to give you the main messages here, if you want to see the precise graphs and magnitudes, the paper has a whole range of those. But in a nutshell, people who are ranked higher in each group think that inequality of incomes within that group is more fair. So if I think I'm ranked higher in my city, I'm going to say it's more fair to have inequality of incomes within a city. If I'm ranked higher within my sector of work, I will say, I think it's fair that there's inequality of incomes within sector of work. People who are ranked higher also believe that income differences in the group are rather due to differences in effort, so your own merit, your own actions, rather than luck, which we define as different circumstances and things outside of your control. So you think that inequality is fair and differences are rather due to own actions and responsibility rather than luck. They're also more likely to vote for right of center parties. So all these things are very strongly correlated with your rank in each group. We also look at how this relates to past social positions. Since we have your whole history, we can ask, does your social position today matter only? Or if we go back in time and look at the relation between your views and where you were 5 years ago or 10 years ago, etc., what do we see? So what we see is that views on fairness are very strongly related to current position. So that seems to be a more malleable thing depending on where you actually stand today. Your past positions are much less predictive of that. On the other hand, if you look at an outcome like your political views, who you tend to vote for, that's actually much stickier. So that tends to be also related to your past social positions quite strongly, and actually even to your parents' social position, where the parents ranked when you were growing up. So these are perhaps views that are stickier and perhaps more related to permanent income rather than fluctuations and transitory income movements. And then finally, remember that we saw that people are most inaccurate about inequality and where they rank in the education and sector groups. But what we find is that actually these are the groups that people think inequalities are most unfair in. So people tend to think that conditional on being in the same sector or in the same firm or with the same education, then inequality beyond that seems to be more unfair than inequality within gender, within cohort, within municipality, which from an economist point of view, can be explained when we think that sector, work, education, those are major determinants of income, also in our models. And so in people's minds, it seems less fair to think conditional on those important things, why would people be making so different incomes? And so it's interesting that the inequalities that people tend to really underestimate are the ones they consider to also be most unfair. Since we have people's histories, we can also look at if particular shocks have affected their views. So we can take shocks that shift social positions, and we can look at positive shocks, such as you were promoted at work, so you changed occupation or job title at work positively. And we can also look at negative shocks, like did you experience unemployment? Did you have a disability? Did you have a hospitalization, etc.? So as you see, some of these shocks are large, but relatively rare, for instance, disability. Others are very frequent, but cause a small change in social position, like hospitalization. And others are somewhere in between. They're relatively common, they cause a relatively sizable shift in position, like unemployment spells or promotions. And so we have a whole range of different shocks. And what we find is that experiencing a negative shock between 5 and 10 years ago makes people think that inequality is less fair. And consistent with what we just saw before, that some views are stickier, there's not much effect on political views or on what you think the role of effort is. So those sticky views are not affected by those fluctuations induced by shocks, but your views on fairness very much affected by the induced movements in your social position. And then finally, we show people where they actually rank within each group. And we do this thanks to this information treatment here. So on the ladder where people actually had to report their position. So for instance, this person guessed that among all people born in 1970, they thought they were at P70, so ranked at the 70th percentile. In the information treatment, this person gets told that actually, not really, you are actually ranked at P57. So you are 13 positions lower than you thought. Other people who tended to underestimate their position will get good news. So they will be updated upwards. We will tell them, oh, actually you're higher by say, 10 positions than you thought. And we do this for all the reference groups. And what do we find? Well, what we find is that there's very asymmetric effects. So on the negative news, it's very much the case, as with the correlations that we showed, and as with the history of negative shocks, that if you receive negative news, so for instance, this person here on the slide that guessed they were at P70 but were wrong, those people now tend to say inequality is less fair, and within all the groups that it's less fair to have income differences contingent on education, sector, etc. On the other hand, positive news, so people who are told they're actually better off than they thought, that has no effect. So in the experiment, definitely bad news weighs more heavily and is more salient than good news. And so if we go back to the main questions that we asked at the beginning, what we can find here is that there's some systematic misperceptions of social positions, but the misperceptions are not that large. And especially if you do this correction, if you realize that perceived positions are mechanically bounded, between 0 and 100, and not uniformly distributed there, you can correct for them. And so there's these systematic, but not huge misperceptions. In general, though, people tend to think others are closer to themselves than they truly are. So people tend to compress inequality towards their own position. The second main finding is that people's current social position is strongly related to their fairness views. And we can see this by correlating position with fairness views by looking at changes in your social position induced by shocks that have happened to you, and even correlating it with past social positions. On the other hand, some stickier views like political affiliation, role of effort, those are related to current position and past position as well. And then finally, the inequalities that people consider to be most unfair are between co-workers in the same sector or firm, and for people with the same education. And those are actually the inequalities that people, ironically, also tend to really underestimate the most, and where they tend to overestimate their position if they're actually lower ranked. So I hope this is a good example of what interesting questions one can address with a match between survey and administrative data. And this is an area that's, I think, very much going forward. And you can think of many, many other questions to answer. And so I'm looking forward to your questions and the discussion now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stefanie. So it's time to questions. Please raise your hand, or you can also write a question in the chat, and I will then read it up for you. Okay, so there's a question here written in the chat, so I will read it up. You show that within sector, people are worse in predicting their position in terms of percentiles than say within the same city. Do you have data on whether this prediction is better when asking for actual income differences? Income may be more equally distributed within sector than within city. Assume I think I am P60 in my sector, whereas in reality I'm P40. Maybe I'm wrong by 20% percentage point in terms of percentiles, but I'm not so wrong in terms of absolute income, because the absolute income difference between P40 and P60 is not that high within sector. Could that be an explanation?
That's a very good question, and you're absolutely right that part of the work that we put in is not just to ask about position, but exactly to your point, we want to know what people actually know about the distribution as well. I didn't show those in the interest of time, but as I mentioned, we elicit what people think the median income is in each reference group and what the P95 is, so what the top 5th percentile income is. So we can see whether people are off sort of on the absolute levels, whether they understand the dispersion as well by comparing what they say on the P50 and P95, and then what they think about the position. And so that was exactly the goal, to try to see which part are people wrong about. And so what we can see is that for sector and education, people are quite accurate about the median income, as they are for other reference groups. But for the high-paying sectors and high-paying education levels, people tend to really underestimate the P95. So they don't realize the extent of the inequality. So that's already there. While they actually understand very well the extent of inequality within municipalities, they're relatively more accurate about the P50 and P95. And so they're already wrong there. And that translates into the fact that if they're ranked lower, since they don't quite realize how high the incomes go in those groups, they tend to overestimate their position more. So we can sort of not formally decompose what comes from where, but we can see that people are already wrong about those absolute levels more in the sector, and they underestimate inequality there.
Okay, so let us take 2 more questions. One from Antonio Cabrales here, which is to the organizing country here. I wonder how this will play out in a non-weird country. Do you have any data on that? And let me, because it's a little related, take the next question by Caroline Colley. Hi, I wanted to ask if you do believe that the knowledge of social position will be the same in more unequal and possibly less transparent countries.
Mm-hmm. Now, these are excellent questions. So if any country allowed us to do it outside of Denmark, we would definitely be takers as well. And there's just incredible data that we can use here. So I think many of the things that we ask are probably generalizable, because it's about relative rankings, and so probably the pattern that people who are ranked lower tend to overestimate the position, those that are ranked higher tend to underestimate it. That's probably a relatively general pattern. From data that's less precise from other countries, you can see this sort of pattern too. Now, whether inequality per se will play a role, mechanically it should not necessarily, because if there's inequality but you're aware of it, you should still be able to respond about your position. And I think that's why it's also valuable to see that when we elicit views on inequality as measured by the median income or the top income in each group, people are more or less accurate about various groups. So that's a good control. And so that would be important to elicit in other countries too. But conditional on that, ranking yourself is not mechanically affected by inequality. Now, the transparency is another issue. That is, that may be incredibly relevant, how much transparency there is. And that's not just administrative transparency, it's also, I guess, the social norms of how much people communicate. To that point, I find it incredibly, and we all found it, we co-authors found it very interesting that within coworkers in a firm, which are people that you interact with, there's clearly no pay transparency. People really do not realize where they rank relative to those. And that transparency is not there, which perhaps could be explained very much by, employers' incentives to maybe not reveal wages or relative compensation, and some sort of more secrecy rather than transparency within coworkers. But it would obviously be great to try and replicate these things in other countries.
We have another one here from Adrian Sutherland, who asks, in your study, you focus on income inequality. In some countries, including the Netherlands, wealth inequality is bigger than income inequality. Do you believe that people's estimate on their relative position in wealth are more precise and less sticky?
Excellent question as well. So here we definitely focus, on income inequality. Wealth is, we were thinking of possibly doing it, but once you start actually thinking how to even ask people about wealth, what to include, what assets to put in, how to elicit this, it actually becomes quickly, even trickier than income. And so it's hard to know what people think in terms of wealth. The thing is that even in Denmark, wealth is much more concentrated, as you say, than income inequality. In the US, it would be even starker with, roughly 70% of people having no other wealth than Social Security, and maybe some housing. So it's actually incredibly concentrated. So I'm not sure whether people would be more or less accurate, because potentially people that have no wealth, they're all in a very large group, so position would not be as relevant. They're all at the zero wealth essentially chunk, and people who are very wealthy, they're probably a slightly different group as well. So would be also very interesting. I'm not sure which way the effect would go. It's almost binary between people that have wealth and people that really don't have wealth.
Okay, I think we have time just for one more question. We have a question here by Mette Gertus asking, how are under and overestimating related to cohort? Is there, for example, any learning over time in terms of estimating where one is in the income distribution?
So that's also a great question. We have these cohorts that are relatively close together, one between 69 and 73. Within those, we don't see an age effect. So over those, 4 or 5 years, you don't become better. Your position also changes, and so over time, and so it is not a fixed thing that you're necessarily learning about. It is something that keeps fluctuating. So we cannot easily test for an age effect of learning over time based on the structure. But I think the reference groups are possibly something that can speak to this, which is, municipality is harder to guess than your direct neighbors, and people are more accurate there. So you can learn from closer contact and exposure. And then some things, as I just again repeated, seem to be much harder to get info on, like your sector or people with the same education or even coworkers in your firm, than possibly asking or seeing your former schoolmates or seeing your neighbors, etc. So some things seem to be easier to learn. But the age effect would be interesting. I agree.
Thank you so much, Stefanie, for a brilliant presentation and some clear answers to really good questions. It's time to go to our next speaker, Ernst Fehr from Zürich. And Ernst, please share your screen. Yeah, it's here now. So the title is The Empirical Role of Preferences.
Okay, thanks, Klaus, for giving me the word. I want to inform the audience about a series of research projects that we do together with a large number of people from Switzerland and Denmark. It's all related. It's also related to this link between experimental measures and administrative data sets. Now, let me start by motivating the presentation and pointing out that one of the most fundamental assumptions, perhaps in economics, concerns the key role of preferences as explanatory variables. Almost all our models assume that preferences jointly with constraints are the ultimate drivers of individuals' economic choices. That means that systematic variation in preferences is predicted to cause systematically different choice behaviors. However, as you will see in a minute, there are enormous challenges to demonstrate the relationship between individuals' preferences and their choices in real life. And here is the first challenge. Typically, we don't have independent measures of preferences available. So preferences are therefore often indirectly inferred from observed facts that are shaped by a multitude of unobserved factors. And that then the identification of preferences requires extremely strong assumptions. And I give you an example which is taken from my own research on countercyclical risk aversion, because I think it's almost impossible to infer countercyclical risk aversion from naturally occurring data. And the reason is the following. When asset prices decline and you want to identify whether risk preferences change due to this decline in asset prices, you have a host of confounding factors, like at the same time subjective expected asset returns change, asset price volatility changes, overall financial wealth changes, the perceived background risk changes, and people's habits change typically. So it seems almost impossible to infer a countercyclical risk aversion from real world data that are not from do not come from a controlled environment. Our solution to this challenge is that we collect independent measures of individuals' time, risk, and social preferences via online methods by using state-of-the-art tools of experimental economics. Another challenge that comes up in this research program is that preferences are only one of a vast number of factors that influence individuals' choices. And these other factors are typically very difficult to measure objectively, although you get some grip on them by asking people. Now, as one solution we choose to overcome that problem is that we collect preference measures from a very large number. Large means here compared to the typical experimental data sets, a very large number. That means in the thousands of individuals that are representative for the population of interest. And the second part of the solution is that we try to link, as Stefanie has shown previously, our experimental data to the Danish administrative data set. And the advantage of that data set is that it offers third-party verified information on a huge number of covariates and outcome variables, capturing real-world behavior. So this is the way we can kind of identify the impact of preferences as separate from the other factors. And examples of the data we can use from this data set, from this administrative data set, in terms of outcome variables is, for example, we have relatively precise information about individuals' wealth. We have pretty precise information on their crime rates or their charitable contributions, because all of this can be inferred from third-party verified objective data. And finally, perhaps the biggest challenge of all is that it appears impossible to randomize preferences to people, or to find plausible exogenous variation that affects only preferences. And therefore, the causal identification of the link between preferences and their impact on behavior appears to be extremely difficult, if not impossible. I mean, there are ways around, like priming technologies, and we can discuss this in the discussion section, but it's very limited. Priming is very limited in its ability to shape preferences. Now, the solution we chose to overcome this problem is that we rely on theory to derive predictions about the relationship between preferences and individuals' choice behavior. And the second part of the solution is that we use high quality third-party verified measures of covariance and control, and as many as possible of them, in particular those suggested by theory. Now, let me tell you what type of studies I'm going to present today. Well, in one study, we asked the question, does variation in individuals' patients explain their rank in the wealth distribution? And wealth has been of increasing interest because wealth inequality is so extremely high in many countries, not just the US, and it's almost everywhere it's bigger than income inequality. The second question we ask, do individuals' other regarding preferences or their social preferences explain their charitable contributions? And the third question we ask in a separate study is, do adolescents' risk and time preferences explain their propensity to engage in criminal behavior? And note that for each of these questions, theory makes clear predictions. For example, for the first question regarding the relationship between patients and wealth, there's a clear prediction that comes from the standard neoclassical growth model or savings model, which says that two individuals with identical income paths have different wealth at all ages in their life, depending on whether an individual has more patients or less patients. So the more patient individual has more wealth at all stages during life. And that's a very clear-cut prediction that is yielded by the theory that we can test with our data set. Now, before I go into the results, let me show you how we measure time preferences. Preference measurement involves some subtle questions. And since we want to measure the preferences of a very large number of people, we have to do this online. And that means we have to make it as simple as possible for people to understand the behavioral tasks that we use to measure their preferences. In all our preference measurements, real money is involved, so there's real stakes involved for the people. And for example, for the case of time preferences, they make savings decisions. Here you see a typical decision screen for the preference elicitation task with regard to time preferences. You see an individual that can shift income from 8 weeks from now to 16 weeks from now. In this case, the individual saved 100 of the 250 endowment it received, and the savings of 100 led to an income of 102.4 in 16 weeks. And what's important here is that individuals face many of these questions at different interest rates that allow us to pin down their discount rates. Now, since I will show you some results on social preferences, I also tell you how we measure social preferences. But before I do that, we do similar things for risk preferences than we do for time preferences, just that we let people make investment decisions at different interest rates and different risks. Now, when it comes to social preferences, the subjects choose one of 7 available allocations of money between themselves and another anonymous participant. And these 7 allocations, they lie on a budget line in the other payoff, self-payoff space. So basically, by giving people many such decision problems with differently sloped budget lines, we can again basically tease out their indifference curves. And note what it's important to consider also budget lines that have a positive slope. Because when budget lines have a positive slope, it seems to be a no-brainer that the individual always choose the allocation that gives him or her the highest income. But if the individual cares for equality, the individual may nevertheless go to the 45-degree line, implying that the individual sacrifices income at the cost of sacrificing also the other person's income. And such an individual we would call envious or behindness averse, and therefore we are able to elicit here envy as well as altruism with this method. And the former and the decision screen typically looks like this. It's very simple for the individual to make these decisions and to see what the individual gets at a particular allocation and what the other individual gets. Okay, now let me answer the questions that I posed. First question, does variation in individuals' patients explain individuals' rank in the wealth distribution? Now, we answered this question in a paper a year ago that was published a year ago in the American Economic Review, and those who are more interested in this can consult this paper. And before I show you the upcoming results, let me point out that I do this by just making graphical illustrations, but in all cases, our outcome measures are not self-reported, but objective third-party verified data from the Danish registry. And all results hold while controlling for a large number of covariates and simultaneously controlling for all other preference measures. Now, do individual discount rates indeed predict the position in the wealth distribution? Here I show you a first result. What you see here is when we partition subjects in equally sized thirds of the population according to their patients, what you see here is that the wealth percentile rank at which subjects are located differs strongly according to whether they are in the high patients group, that implies typically that are at a higher wealth percentile rank, or whether they are in the low or the medium patients group. Now you might ask yourself, is this a big or a small effect? Well, you can answer this by comparing it to other important variables that are supposed to play a role for individuals' wealth rank. And here is part of this answer. What you see here in the right graph is, for example, parental wealth of the individuals we look at. And you see that the higher parental wealth is, the higher are individuals located in the wealth distribution. So parental wealth clearly has an important role to play. But what was really surprising to us is that patients and education have a similar role for the wealth rank. And notice, high education typically even requires some patience, and so that the overall impact of patients is perhaps even underestimated by controlling for education in our results. But when we are interested in the savings mechanism, then that's the appropriate thing to do. And you see that patients has a similarly high impact on wealth like education. Now, let me ask the question whether the variation in individual social preferences explains their charitable distributions, their charitable donations, and their demand for redistribution. And here I can rely on our individual measures of envy and altruism from the experiment. And in the left graph, what you see is the more highly individuals are ranked in terms of altruism, the more they typically donate to charity. And the more highly they are ranked on the envy scale, the less they donate to charity, which is exactly what one would expect from a theory perspective, that if you are an envious person or an altruistic person, you are supposed to behave in the ways we observe it here. We have now I come to further questions. That's the only case here in my presentation where we use self-reported data. And the question is whether variation in envy and altruism explains individuals' demand for redistribution. And here we would also basically have a theory prediction from when we use social preference theory and put it in political economy models. We would get the prediction that individuals who are more altruistic or more aheadness averse are more in favor of political redistribution to reduce income differences. And the same would hold for envious people, that they should also be more in favor of political redistribution. And that's exactly what we observe here. So the higher the altruism rank, the higher is the preference for political redistribution, and the higher is the envy rank of the people, the higher is the desire for distribution via political means. But I should add here, perhaps when we look at envy ranks, we always control for age, so to speak. So this is really within cohort ranks, you know, it's not totally uncontrolled what we show in these figures. Now, the final question I want to go into is whether adolescents' economic preferences explain their crime rates. Now, crime rates are notoriously difficult, crime rate data are notoriously difficult to get at with self-reports because individuals have obviously a reason to understate their criminal activities. But with the Danish registry data, it's possible to overcome this because we have objective convictions available. And here we study the role of risk tolerance and impatience in crime. And again, a standard Becker model of crime would suggest that individuals who are more willing to take risk, they're also more willing to commit crimes because crimes are risky activities. Or individuals that are more impatient, they are more willing to commit crimes. Why? Because, well, the future cost of crime in terms of the sanctions you may get may loom less currently when you are deciding whether to commit the crime, when you are more impatient. And that's exactly what you observe. This is quantitatively large effects of risk preferences on the propensity to commit crimes, and similarly, a pretty large effect of impatience on the propensity to commit crimes. And I would like to add here that these two effects are largely constrained to property crimes. So that is interesting. They are not showing up as strongly or even as significant effects for violent drug or sexual offenses, for which self-control seems to be key, whereas for property crimes, risk and time preferences seems to play a big role, which is what is in accordance with our intuitions, I think. And with that, I'm already at the end. So let me summarize. I think it's fair to say that economists assume almost always that preferences are key drivers of economic outcomes and behaviors. And I would even add that the preference outcome link concerns perhaps one of the most fundamental assumptions we have in economics and one of the least tested assumptions, because it is so deeply ingrained in our thinking that we typically take that for granted. I mean, some people, I give you an example at the end of my talk. When I presented the wealth inequality result first to my colleagues at the University of Zurich, they said, so what? We always knew that more impatience means less savings and less wealth. Well, we didn't know, we believed to know. And there's a big difference between believing that you know or whether you know. And the real knowledge means you have the empirical evidence. And there's another kind of little story behind this. I was once, when I was interested in studying social norms, I wrote, and their impact on their causal impact, I wrote an email to a famous sociologist and saying, give me the evidence that's from sociology, because you are interested in social norms. You always say social norms are important. Give me the evidence about the causal or the even only correlational role of social norms for real behavior. And he said, I can't give you evidence because we take it for granted. And I think it's not as bad in economics when it comes to the role of preferences and outcomes, but it's a much understudied issue. And I think there is a way to study these problems now. And I hope that the examples that I've shown you stimulated you to consider similar things. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Ernst. It's time for questions. So if anybody have a questions, they can raise their hand and I can give them the word, or they can write in the Q&A. So there is a question from Antonio Cabrales, who is asking, do you have data on evolution of preferences over time and how they relate to other variables?
Well, we have collected data over time, but the time period between the different measurement points is probably too short to use the word evolution. But we do have data collected, let's say in 2016 or 17, and then data collected in 3 or 4 years later. And I hope that we are able to collect even further data, because what we are ultimately also interested in is the determinants of preferences. You know, in the same way that Stefanie in the previous paper asked the question, what do economic shocks do to fairness views? We are interested in what do economic or social shocks do to economic preferences, because in the more long run, preferences are clearly not as stable as it's typically assumed. And it's an interesting question how they are shaped by the economic and social environment. But currently we don't have data on that are really worthwhile to examine in more depth.
Thank you so much, Ernst, also. And I think you have persuaded people listening to be convinced. And thank you both for some nice presentations here. And with these words, I think we will close the session so people can have a short break. Okay, now actually, okay, let's take one question. There's one more question here that came in. So related to Antonio's question, evolution theory may have useful off-the-shelf predictions on how age and other factors may affect how preferences evolve over one's time.
Well, actually, we do have one interesting observation with regard to time preferences over time and gender differences. So there are patterns here, how time preferences evolve with age. Now the problem is that, I mean, since we have preferences from 20 or even 19 years old to 64-year-old people, we can see how that goes over time. Now, one tricky question here is always to what extent we can separate age effects from cohort, from generation effects, so to speak. And that also would require kind of even another data collection from a different generation. And that just underscores the importance of these data collection efforts. On the other hand, one can do with our data, one can have a preliminary look and whether it coincides with evolutionary theory. So if you can point us to some nice papers, Ingela, what evolutionary theory predicts in terms of age dependence of preferences, we would be very grateful to you.
Yes, thank you so much. Now I will close the session. So again, thank you both, Ernst and Stefanie, and thank you everybody for participating. And this just gives the 5-minute break to before the next session will start. Thank you so much, everyone.
Okay, bye.